All right, so the first question I'm going to answer comes from Jill Barrett. She has an awesome channel. I'd highly recommend it. I'm still just so happy that she replied to my comment at all. Um, but yeah, so that question was Jill was saying strangely specific. I definitely spent some time researching this a while ago because I had the same question, so it makes sense. And that is the thickness of steel late medieval European plate armor. Um, because it's hard to tell. There's a lot of reproductions out there that are very, very, very thin. There's a lot of like LARP armor and stuff, very thin, like very thin steel. It's not super accurate, and then at the same time, there are some misconceptions and cosplay armor and video game armor and things in movies and stuff like that that is very thick. And so it's like where's the balance? Um, and the answer is interesting. It's kind of complicated. And the answer is that it varies. There is a range, but it varies. And sometimes it varies from one piece of the same plate to another piece of the same plate. Like, not even the same piece of armor, but the same plate. So, like, eh, not only will it sometimes vary from like say this plate to this plate, but sometimes it will vary from like say here to here on the same plate. That's just an example. But and the reason for that is two things. Partially the manufacture of the plate armor. These days we can just get sheet steel and then hammer it into the shape that we need it to be. Uh, at the time, they would just get a big piece of steel, like a big lump of steel. They'd have to heat it up a lot and then just hammer it flat. And then that really gave them the freedom to make it thicker in some parts and thinner in some parts. It's like playing with Play-Doh, but with a hammer and a 2,000-degree forge. Um, and so, what benefit that had, it's pretty cool, is they could put more protection on places that need it and less protection on the places that didn't need it, and that reduced the weight because the thickness of the armor has a ton to do with the weight. And this is talking about I'm mostly talking about late 14th through 15th century armor generally as a whole, and 16th century armor really, but that's where you get some more specialized stuff. So generally, oh man, this guy decided to say hi. Okay, so generally, they would have it thicker on, say, around like the sternum or the heart area. So right here on the chest, and that's where you're going to get a lance strike. With the weight of a horse behind it, which is pretty crazy. So you know, that's pretty necessary. It's also on your heart. Your heart's pretty much under your sternum for the most part. Um, and then it can get thinner on the sides. It can have thinner on the back because that's not so much where a lance is going to hit. The helmet is going to be thicker as well. The helmet and that part of the breastplate are usually about the same thickness. And I'm going to get into specific thicknesses in a minute. Uh, so yeah, so they would really do their best to protect the specific vital organs. So it's like you can get hurt potentially, but you're going to be safe. Like your life is going to be safe, and that's what they're going for. Um, and so that's kind of interesting to think about. So bear that in mind. They would try to reduce the weight by varying the thickness. So I'm going to get into some specific thicknesses. I need to grab my list. All right. So do. So the thicker parts, so like the sternum area on the breastplate, and the helmet, were about 1.5 to 2 millimeters. All right. And um, in American manufacturing terms, that's 16 gauge to 14 gauge. And the gauge is the denominator of the fraction. So it's saying 1/16 of an inch to 1/14 of an inch. So that's kind of confusing. But yeah, 1.5 to 2 millimeters, that's the thickest part. That kind of gives you an idea of the thickness of the rest of it because it all goes thinner from there. And of course, there are, uh, you know, what do you call them? There are other examples, there are exceptions, but this is general. Um, do do do. So what else is interesting is these days in modern armor manufacture, which is for like reenactment and I mean my stuff. That's made by Marshall Historical, by the way. They have a great price for a wonderful product. It's pretty darn historically accurate. Matt Easton and Scala Gladiatoria has talked about them a little bit. I love that guy. He doesn't even know I exist. He's the best. But yeah, so it has the Matt Easton bald British head, thumbs up of approval. But anyway, I digress. um, so what's interesting is that modern plate manufacture, it would be a lot harder and more time consuming to buy the big chunk of steel and to then hammer it flat and make some parts thinner and some parts thicker. So what they do, and I think this is genius, what they do is they will take one plate and make that plate an approximate kind of average or average thickness for what that plate would be historically. So that way they don't have to make the plate thinner and thicker in different parts, but they do vary the thickness from plate to plate. This is more high-end armorers I'm talking about, which is such a niche job, so don't even worry about it. These ones by Marshall Historical, so I just have like the arm and the leg armor for the most part, and a helmet, but that's not by Marshall Historical, actually. That's by House of Warfare, and Marshall Historical is a lot better. But anyway, so this is 16 gauge steel, or I guess, what would that be? 1.5 millimeters. So that is a little bit on the thicker side as far as like the arm and leg armor goes, but pretty accurate and safe as well. This is just mild steel, which is also relatively accurate. I don't want to get into that right now, sorry. But yeah, so that's pretty accurate. They could have varied the plates, but that would have taken, of course, time and effort. It would have reduced the weight a little bit, but I really don't think it's such a big deal. So yeah, they kind of just took the average and went with that, and that's pretty cool. If you want to get into a few more nitty-gritty details, the helmet, the breastplate, so the upper part of the chest terminating at about the belly button or the abs, and the placard, which was another piece of armor that came up from the stomach and kind of overlapped the breastplate over the top. All those pieces, modern armorers will do about 14 gauge steel or 2 millimeters. So that's kind of the average. And I say this because this is more practical today. It's nice to know that they varied the steel thickness throughout the armor at the time. That's great to know. However, even high-end armorers generally won't do that these days. So that's why I'm going off of those terms. The joints for these modern armorers, so like the elbow pieces, the knee pieces, it's called the couture. So this cup right here specifically, and the Pauline is the part on the knee. They'll generally do those about 16 gauge steel or about 1.5, 1.6 millimeters thick. So that's where my armor is right on. So that's pretty cool. In addition to the vambrace, the part right here for the lower arm, what do you call it? The forearm? The rear brace, the part for the upper arm, but not these little segments called lames. Those are usually thinner. So all those parts are usually 16 gauge, about 16 gauge or 1.6 millimeters. So that's pretty cool, and that is, generally speaking, the average for the historical armors, at least for the 15th century. 15th century is 1400s, by the way, and that's also late medieval transitioning into Renaissance. I use those terms with abandon nowadays, but it took me so long to figure out that system. But anyway, and then some smaller pieces like the fingers, the little finger scales like these, and the lames, the little smaller plates between the larger ones. They'll usually do about 18 gauge or 1.2 millimeters thick. And then that's about as thin as it gets, really. So about 1/18 an inch of steel, which is pretty thin. A little bit thinner than I was expecting, really, like for to have any of the armor. But if you're having overlapping scales or lames that are overlapping, even with thicker parts, then that's all you really need. The I can do multiple videos. Oh my gosh, yeah, about how the armor works, how it deflects things instead of just taking the damage, but sometimes it does. It's a whole topic, but so that's the approximate thickness, and you can imagine how much that would reduce the weight of the overall armor. Um, I might save more details on weight of armor for a later video, uh, but generally speaking, a full suit of plate armor is 45 to 65 pounds. That's pretty hard to imagine or visualize, and that's the part that I want to do more research on and make another video for. I want to find things that are 45 to 65 pounds, but one interesting thing is that that is actually a little bit less, and this is so generally speaking, you guys. I'm not an expert in these sort. I'm not technically an expert. I'm just someone who has done a lot of time and effort and research. So anyway, just getting that out of the way. But generally speaking, 45 to 65 pounds of armor. So, averaging around 50 pounds. I think mine altogether, I don't have anything on my torso yet besides just padded armor. But I think mine altogether is in like 40 or so pounds. But anyway, so averaging around 50 pounds, that is actually less weight, a little bit less weight than the modern US soldier carries and the modern US firefighter. So that kind of puts into perspective a little bit. These people didn't have to be superhuman. So yeah, so that's steel thickness of plate armor. I'd love to hear any comments or questions or tips or suggestions that you may have. Thank you so much for watching. You're amazing people. Remember to love yourselves. And I'll see you later.